everyone. My name is Marta. I'm a postdoc at the MPI of Animal Behavior in Konstanz, Germany. And today I'll talk about how we use spectrogram-based latent-space representations to study animal vocalizations. So we are interested in how animals use vocal communication to coordinate themselves as a group. And we do that by putting GPS and audio collars on wild animals and basically record every move they make and every sound they emit. And so far we've collected data from meerkats, coatis, and hyenas. And what we are interested in now is how can we identify patterns and sort of define call types in an objective and unbiased way in these data sets. Last year we came across this paper which describes a method that may accomplish just that. So the authors used unsupervised dimensionality reduction to project acoustic data into a lower dimensional space, thus visualizing entire vocal repertoires in a way that makes it easy to detect patterns in them. So we were wondering whether this method might be useful for our analysis and thus decided to test it with our data. And we chose the meerkat data because the vocal repertoire of meerkats is actually quite well described, and we do have a data set which is manually labeled, so human listeners already classified each call into a specific type. So we know sort of the ground truth and can compare it to the results of this unsupervised approach to sort of validate it that way and analyze its strengths and weaknesses. The general procedure is that you start with the sound file, generate a spectrogram, row-wise concatenate it to obtain a feature vector, and then reduce the dimensionality of this vector using UMAP, a neighborhood-based dimensionality reduction algorithm. So what's interesting about this is that you do not extract any acoustic features, but you merely use the spectrogram as input. We did this for a data set of about 6,000 meerkat calls, and even though it seems like a very crude method, we were actually quite intrigued by the first results. So these are the latent space representations in 2D. Each data point represents a vocalization, and they are color-coded by their manual call type labels. And so you can see that there is clearly some separation here, even though the call types do not completely fall into distinct clusters. We also developed an interactive tool which allowed us to explore the latent space a bit further in 3 dimensions. Hovering over the data points triggers the display of the respective spectrogram here on the left, and the table in the upper left corner provides some additional information on this vocalization, such as the individual that gave the call, its duration, and so on and so forth. And by clicking on a data point, the audio is displayed. And we found that this tool was quite useful to explore the space and sort of get an intuition on whether the representations make sense and what types of calls are usually grouped together. We also attempted to quantify the separation of call types by counting how often specific call types are found in close neighborhood of each other. In doing this for all data points, we ended up with this neighborhood matrix. You would read it such that, for example, in the first row, given a data point with the label aggressive call, 44% of its 5 nearest neighbors are also aggressive calls, which is considerably more than would be expected by random chance. And if you look at the whole row, you can also see that there's, for example, a considerable proportion, 35%, of social calls in the neighborhood of aggressive calls. So most importantly, the diagonal is the same class neighborhood frequency, and it is on average 62% for this data set. But there's a lot more information in this matrix, and we used it to build a graph representing how often call types are found in close vicinity of each other. And this nicely confirmed that calls that we also perceive as similar, and which are most interestingly also given in similar biological contexts, such as lead and move calls or social and aggressive calls, are also often found close to each other in the latent space representation. So this sort of supports the notion that this representation is somewhat meaningful. We also compared the spectrogram approach to a more conventional bioacoustic approach, where we extracted a number of acoustic features from the data, like the peak frequency, mean fundamental frequency, and several more. And then we applied dimensionality reduction on that acoustic feature vector and compared the resulting evaluation matrix to the one from the spectrogram approach. We found that these matrices are actually highly similar, which is further evidence that the spectrogram approach, despite its simplicity and crudeness, can actually be quite useful. In another step, we investigated how different hyperparameters in the computational pipeline affected the results, because there are many steps where you can sort of tweak parameters and you might end up with slightly different representations. Altogether, we found that the analysis was actually quite robust to all the changes that we applied. However, we did see some effects in our dataset, such as that the application of a MEL transformation was useful, or of a transformation of the spectrogram onto a decibel scale. And we also found that projecting into more than 4 or 5 dimensions in latent space did not further improve the results. So choosing 3 to 5 dimensions may be sufficient for downstream applications. So what downstream applications are there? A natural one would be to apply a clustering algorithm on the latent space, and that's exactly what we did, and compared the clusters to the manual labels. We saw that in general there was a good agreement, meaning that we had a high purity of the detected clusters of being composed of only one call type, or if it was composed of more than one call type, those were usually very similar ones. What we also do is we use this method to classify ambiguous calls. We have some vocalizations in the dataset where the human labelers were not sure in which category to put them in. And we projected these calls, shown in red here, into the space and classified them based on the nearest neighbors. And that way we have sort of an objective and automated way to classify these ambiguous calls as one or another. We also use the method to identify errors in our dataset, that is, calls that have been mislabeled. So we search for data points that are surrounded by the wrong call type, so to say, pull these out and reevaluate them. And it turns out that we can actually catch quite a few errors with this method. We're also looking at using the distance in latent space as a measure of similarity to answer some biological questions, such as to study whether calls encode individual identity or how calls change over time or during conversation. And lastly, we've used the method to validate the call categorization for coatis, because there's only very little known about their call system, and so it was nice to see that our manual call categorization and the similarity between the calls was actually nicely reflected in the latent space representation. Yeah, so these were our experiences with this method, and I hope that sharing them was useful to some of you. Thank you to everyone who's contributed to this work, a truly amazing group of international collaborators. And I'm happy to chat more about everything, answer questions, or also share code. Just send me a message, and thanks a lot for listening.